England, in the early years of the 19th century, the modern world was being forged. Machines revolutionized production. Mass manufacture turned society inside out. In the 19th century, Christianity would be challenged on all fronts, as an institution and as a faith, and certainty would become a thing of the past.
People talk about this or that being the age of faith. Well, there is no doubt at all that the Victorian age was the age of doubt. Doubt was the prevailing sentiment of the 19th century.
The New England brought new wealth and opportunity to the rising middle class of traders and manufacturers. A huge new working class migrated to the cities to service the machine. Beneath all, an underclass languished, apparently condemned to misery and want. How would the church respond?
The Church of England was totally unprepared for the changes that it had to face in the 19th century. It was a predominantly agricultural and small market town society, and the Church of England had been organised to minister to that sort of society. It was simply not geared up to deal with the enormous population shifts of the 19th century. It didn't have the manpower, it didn't have the ecclesiastical plant in terms of buildings in the places in which it was needed. So it did find these changes extremely difficult to respond to.
One solution suggested itself: build more churches. However, it soon became apparent that for the new army of urban workers, Christian worship was hardly a priority.
If you just imagine the ordinary day of a factory hand, somebody working on the loom, somebody going down the mines, a child being shoved up a chimney, sweeping crossings in London or whatever it might be. People in the industrial working class simply didn't have the energy to practice a religion.
In early 19th century England, the chasm between the haves and have-nots was obvious. Surely here was another challenge to the fundamental duty of Christians to show compassion, to engage with their fellows.
The very astonishing thing when you read the Gospels, which seem to be full of injunctions, both to imitate the humility of the poor and to help the hungry and the needy, is that Christians, for the most part, do not seem to have taken any notice of these divine commandments. And people seem perfectly happy in the Church of England to carry on going to morning prayer and returning to their comfortable houses without a single thought of people who are sick or naked or in prison. And the astonishing thing about the history of the 19th century church is how late it woke up to the miserable condition of people living in the cities.
Even the most complacent couldn't ignore the suffering. In the 1830s, the churches began to mount expeditions into the city's slums. Urban missionaries offered moral instruction to the poor, but they seemed to be more interested in where the next meal would come from rather than in God's word. A more robust and practical approach was taken by the Salvation Army founded by William Booth, a Nottingham pawnbroker who'd been affronted by the poverty he'd seen. Along with his wife, he came up with a new formula to save souls.
He found a wonderful combination of theatrical excitement and sort of military precision. It was the Salvation Army. Praying was called knee drill. There was a wonderful phrase for their magnificent songs which were set to music hall tunes and things with new words, which was called rollicking for the Lord. And the whole thing was exciting and fun and warm and wonderful.
It was also effective. Of course, God's soldiers were after your soul, but they realized that sinners couldn't turn to God if they were bedeviled by cold, hunger, or drink. The army provided realistic help, soup kitchens and shelters as well as sermons. They set out to feed body and soul. The machine thundered on. Change was everywhere and accelerating. For many, it seemed that civilization itself was spinning out of control. Many Anglicans felt the changes were too rapid and too threatening. They longed for stability and tradition. Far from the machines and the slums, the Oxford movement was born. At its head were the college fellows John Keble and John Henry Newman. Influential because of support in the middle and upper classes, the Oxford movement was dedicated to preserving the Anglican Church's position in an increasingly unstable world.
Well, the Oxford movement is a very odd thing. It was an extraordinary, head-in-sand, last-ditch attempt of the most high Tory, high and dry Tory kind, to establish the Church of England as the only church in these islands.
They wanted the church to reassert itself, and they felt the way in which it could do this was to recapture some of the Catholic heritage of the Church of England. So they tried to look back and to try to rescue from medieval Christianity everything that they thought was not corrupt and try to reintegrate it into the life of the Church of England.
We are upholding that primitive church which was delivered for all time by the early teachers of the church and which is attested in the... There is a visible church with sacraments and rites which are channels of invisible grace, the Anglican Church.
Very much of the impact of the Oxford movement was on the church's attitude to worship. The early leaders of the Oxford movement were extremely keen to emphasize the Eucharistic worship of the church.
For the Oxford movement, the essence of worship lay in the beauty and mystery of sharing the blood and body of Christ. Their focus was the altar rather than the pulpit. But the accompanying emphasis on vestments, incense, candles and music raised not a few Protestant hackles.
When the leaders of the Oxford movement began to say, well, we're really Catholics and not Protestants, the ordinary Englishman began to say, well, these people are traitors to the Church of England. They're actually trying to turn the Church of England into the Roman Catholic Church. They're trying to make it the very thing which it isn't. And so there were riots in some churches which introduced Roman ceremonial, and there were court cases in which half a dozen clergy were actually sent to prison for conducting illegal rituals in the church.
But the mainstream Anglican Church was also looking to the past. From the 1840s, churches all over England were being made over in the Gothic style, harking back to a romanticized vision of the Middle Ages. For the Victorians, the Middle Ages stood for things they felt they were losing: peace, stability, a social order in which everyone knew their place and stayed in it. The face of England's cities changed as buildings like St Pancras and the new Houses of Parliament arose, expressing civilized Christian values in Gothic architecture. Painters too, like the Pre-Raphaelites, chose to locate their subjects in medieval settings. But no amount of nostalgia would protect Christianity from the cold scrutiny of reason and the discoveries of science. In the 19th century, natural philosophy, the study of the material world, matured into science, the systematic examination of the processes and laws of nature. Increasingly, every aspect of physical reality came under scrutiny. Religious belief and Christianity itself were not exempt. In the middle of the century, German scholars began to stalk God. They proposed the idea of God as the expression of man's inner longings and aspirations. Man, they argued, had to invent God. Then they turned to the life and teachings of Jesus Christ with devastating effect.
David Strauss, in his Life of Jesus, applied to the Gospels the sort of textual criticism that people had already applied to the poems of Homer, and tried to separate the bits which looked as though they'd been added from what was perhaps there originally. And so he came to the conclusion that all the supernatural bits, the miracles and so on, were myth, added by followers later. And that what was left, because there is very little of a straightforward historical nature in the Gospels, was all we could know about Jesus. He believed Jesus was a historical character, but one of whom we can know very little. And that, again, was profoundly shocking to people. Many people nowadays would agree with it, but it was a big shock then.
The English translator of the life of Jesus was Mary Ann Evans, famous later as novelist George Eliot. The task reduced her to tears as she felt her faith being torn to shreds. Compelled towards atheism, she summed up the experience of many thinking Victorians. The process of erosion continued. Geology, the study of rocks and fossils, was the queen of Victorian science, practiced by professional scientists and amateurs alike. Finding and selling fossils was a source of income to some, like Mary Anning in Lyme Regis. But the study of rock formations and fossils led to an inevitable conflict between scientific and biblical accounts of the Earth's origin.
There was the great conflict developed between the hugeness of the timescales, which geology was revealing, and the very small timescales which went with the literal interpretation of Genesis. So the fallback position number one for the religious people was, well, Genesis is only metaphorical. It doesn't actually mean 6 days, it means 6 eons. Of course, the flood happened, and they began to get a bit doubtful about the flood. Had the flood really happened? Had there been lots of floods? Was the flood confined to Europe, or did it go over the whole world? How can you find fossils at the tops of mountains of great antiquity? How on earth have they got there?
And it's worth remembering that only 2 centuries before, an Anglican Archbishop, Archbishop Usher, had confidently announced a fact which remained in Bibles up to this century, that the world was created on a Sunday during October, starting on Sunday during October, in the year 4004 BC, making it therefore around 6,000 years old. And people believed this, and it clearly was impossible with all these fossils. So what to do about it? And some thinkers went so far as to say that God did create the world in 4004 BC, but he put fossils in when he did so to confuse and mislead arrogant scientists. So they were all geared up with all sorts of excuses. Then along comes Darwin, and suddenly the evidence for evolution is really quite overwhelmingly large.
In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, conclusions drawn from exhaustive and meticulous observation of life forms on the Galapagos Islands and elsewhere. Darwin proposed that life forms were the way they were because they changed through countless generations in a process of adaptation to their environments. This meant both that life forms hadn't been fixed in a single act of creation and that living creatures evolved according to rules other than God's design. Darwin suggested that man might share a common ancestor with the apes. He never claimed man was descended from apes. An unexceptional idea now, it provoked outrage among Victorians and prompted the most public confrontation between the now deeply flustered church and Darwin's supporters.
In the furore over Darwin's Origin of Species, an institution called the British Association for the Advancement of Science was rather quick off the mark and held a meeting in Oxford to discuss this burning topic. And two of the speakers they invited were T.H. Huxley, who had become the sort of greatest advocate of Darwin's views. And opposite him was an extremely smooth Anglican cleric called Samuel Wilberforce. And he was so smooth that he was known to contemporaries as Soapy Sam.
This is the room where the debate took place. Now it houses thousands of insect specimens for the Oxford University Museum. Then it rang with claim and counterclaim. Archbishop Wilberforce, willfully or otherwise misinterpreting Darwin, attempted sarcasm, inquiring of Huxley whether he claimed descent from the apes on his grandmother or grandfather's side, and whether this ancestry pleased him. Huxley, it said, replied that given the choice between being related to apes or to human beings who chose to use their intelligence to deny truth, he would choose to throw in his lot with the apes. Wilberforce lost the debate. Like many Christians of the day, he'd failed to find an adequate response to the century's biggest idea.
The Christians in the 19th century were a deplorable lot, really. I mean, they didn't deserve to survive. But people need religion. Perhaps they need God, who knows. The idea of God is a very resilient one, and the idea of God did not die.
But Christianity had suffered a body blow. In the churches, attendances fell off as the climate became increasingly secular. Now more people were looking to science than to religion for explanations of the world. As the 19th century drew to a close, Christian faith was on the ebb. Its elegy had been written almost 50 years earlier in Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach.
The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world.